specifically names elsewhere in the essay the seminal ethnomusicologist Alan Merriam, who had in fact recently visited Nigeria. Western authorities subscribe to the notion that music is an aspect of human behavior, and that therefore music must be studied from many standpoints. But were we to attempt to sell this idea to traditional man in Nigeria, he would tell us to get lost.
Ṣebí wọ́n fi búrẹ́dì jẹ bọ́tà, ó yẹ kí n lè fi gàrí jẹ bọ́tà, mo lè fi ẹ̀fọ́ jẹ kọ́, mo lè fi ẹ̀fọ́ jẹ yán, ṣebí wọ́n fi ẹ̀kọ́ jàkàrà, ó yẹ kí n lè fi yán jàkàrà, ara ẹ̀ wá gbọ́n lọ. Mo lè fi dòdò jọbẹ̀, mo lè fi iṣu jọbẹ̀, ṣebí wọ́n fi dòdò jẹrẹsì, ó yẹ kí n lè fi iṣu jẹrẹsì, mo lè fi búrẹ́dì jẹ̀wà, mo lè fi gàrí jẹ̀wà, ṣebí wọ́n fi búrẹ́dì jẹ bọ́tà, ó yẹ kí n lè fi gàrí jẹ bọ́tà. Iyán tó tó fùfú lọ́lọ́, 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 today fìlà òṣìkè. Ìjẹ̀ṣà ni mí, ẹ bá mi gbé yán mi, Èkìtì ni mí, máa jẹ yán fóṣù kan gbáko, iyán tó funfun lálá, ẹ fún mi ní iyán, lọ́jí kò bá mi rárá, kó sátidé fìlà òṣìkí, kó wọ bàtà ìṣápá ní lọ́jíìkì mi. Fi búrẹ́dì jẹ̀wà, mo lè fi gàrí jẹ̀wà, ṣebí wọ́n fi búrẹ́dì jẹ bọ́tà, ó yẹ kí n lè fi gàrí jẹ bọ́tà, mo lè fi wọ́n fi ẹ̀kọ́ jàkàrà. Lọ́jíìkì mi pé mo lè ṣe jíìkì tó fọmọ yọ. Ní àkótán ara, mo lè ṣohunkóhun, tí n bá ti fèrò mi ṣọ̀kan, ohun gbogbo ti di ṣíṣe fún mi.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our maiden edition of our personality lecture series. This is the first in the department, and we are happy. Please, I'd like to start by welcoming members of staff and some of our online audience. Let me start by welcoming Dr. Tuluwa. Thank you for coming. We also want to appreciate our online audience from all over the world, from the United States of America, from South Africa, from Germany, and others within Nigeria. This forum is to give us that space for academic conversation, especially around music studies. We hope that this will continue as long as we have that opportunity. This program is historic, one, because this is the first. Two, we're having our lecturer from Boston University, United States of America, who is a Latin American but has a very keen interest in Yoruba music studies. So I'd like to welcome again, virtually, Michael Quintero. Thank you for joining us, Michael. All right. I also want to thank our students from the department and outside the department for joining this event. So please, we need you to listen attentively. And after the lecture, we are going to have time for question and answer. And we'll take some responses. So if you are able to listen, and I encourage you to listen, you'll be able to engage the lecturer and the lecture. So it's very important for us to maintain decorum in this event. I want to say that it's a privilege for us to have this space to have this conversation. So without wasting our time, I'd like to say you are welcome, and I hope that you enjoy this evening. Let me especially appreciate our Dean of Faculty of Arts, Professor Oye Ishile, who is also joining us virtually. We thank you for your support, sir. You just listened to our year one students perform Logic Gari Atibota. Very comic. I'm sure that at the end of this program, we'll be able to understand the logic of Gari and butter. So once again, I welcome you to this very inspiring and thought-provoking lecture, and I'm sure that you will enjoy it. Thank you. Let me invite Mr. Tunji Dada of the Department of Music to give us the citation of the guest.
My job here is to read out a citation of our lecturer this afternoon. Like you heard, he's an associate professor of music and the chair of musicology and ethnomusicology at the Boston University. Michael Quintero received his master's and doctoral degrees in ethnomusicology at New York University. His research focuses on the music of the black inhabitants of Colombia's Pacific Coast region. His book, Rights, and Rhythms, A Genealogy of Musical Meaning in Colombia's Black Pacific, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019, examines the feedback, the interference, and overlap between different experiences of Curalao music as ritual sonority, political resource, and popular music. By tracking their historical emergence, development, and maintenance or abandonment as systems of meaning that frame musical sound at the present day conjuncture of neoliberalism, cultural mobilization, and the civil war in Colombia. His work uses both fieldwork and historical methods to examine music as emerging from people's sonic practices, as having real-world ramifications, and as being available to be interpreted in divergent ways. He is particularly interested in tracing the ways that blackness has been framed through music from colonialism to multiculturalism, the efficacy of states' cultural policies and social movements, culture and politics, black cosmopolitanism, and vernacular uses of technology. The cultural, social, economic, technological, and legal aspects of music circulation, ontological framings of music as practice or object, and the ways in which experiences of loudness can illustrate the dynamics of power, the social meaning of violence, and the delineation of public and private in the global South. Before arriving at the Boston University, he taught at Bowdoin College. He was a visiting postdoctoral fellow at the anthropology department of Johns Hopkins University and the musicology department of Peabody Conservatory. Through an Andrew Mellon Fellowship in Concepts of Diaspora. He was a visiting professor in the doctoral program in Afro-Latin American History, Society and Culture at the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, through a Fulbright Core Scholar grant. He has received awards including the Society for Ethnomusicology's Seeger Prize and a Fulbright IIE pre-doctoral research grant, and was honored to be invited to deliver the keynote address at the first annual Congress of Marimba and Traditional Song of the Colombian Pacific in Buenaventura, Colombia. Initiatives with the Colombian Ministry of Culture, established and directed a grassroots community music archive with the Asociación de Investigaciones Culturales del Choco, composed PSA jingles for the Afro-Colombian activist organization Proceso de Comunidades Negras, collaborated with Colombian scholars, appeared on NPR's Morning Edition and the Afropop Worldwide podcast. And he also organized tours and workshops with musicians. Can we give a hand of applause?
Hello, everyone. I am deeply humbled by the generous invitation by Professor Samuel Ajoshe to speak to you today in the inaugural lecture of the University of Ibadan Department of Music's Personality Series. I am particularly honored to be joined by members of the Association of Nigerian Musicologists. And irrespective of my own participation today, I would like to wish the department much success in this speaker series and in its broader goals of forming a new generation of Nigerian musicologists and ethnomusicologists, and in the admirable and necessary work of the Ibadan Sustainable Music Project. Although I work in a school of music, and most of you are in a department of music, in this talk I deliberately distance myself from the notion of music. I will be using somewhat evasive near synonyms like sound arts and sounded poetics instead. This is because my argument today, as I will explain, is that the notion of music is a Western concept despite its pretensions to universality, a limited and decidedly non-universal category that fails to describe much of what it is supposed to include, especially when applied to non-Western sound arts. On the other hand, I cannot assume either that simply because non-Western sounded arts are not categorizable as music in the Western sense, that they are all the same. Many musicologists, ethnomusicologists, and anthropologists have found it fruitful to engage with broader notions than music, such as sound, noise, and soundscapes. These are borrowed from the field of sound studies and experimental composers like the Canadian musician R. Murray Schafer. But notions of sound and noise, of noisemakers and listeners, are also culturally specific and non-universal. I suggest a far more locally specific approach to sound and music. In doing so, I will suggest some paths towards a specifically Yoruba poetics of sound, what I call here an Isheshe ear, or Yoruba traditional sound world. Now, I should warn you, this is entirely new work that I have yet to actually do the field work for, and that I am presenting publicly today for the first time. This is, of course, tremendously presumptuous on my part, which makes Professor Ajoshe's invitation and your attention even more generous. I am, as you may have noticed, neither Yoruba nor Nigerian myself. I do not speak the Yoruba language with any fluency, although Mongbianju, I am trying. I have not even had the pleasure of visiting Yoruba land, although I hope to rectify that in the coming year or so. Therefore, for the Yoruba members of the audience, I beg your indulgence for my poor pronunciation and my very likely missteps in engaging so clumsily with the tremendous richness and complexity of Isheshe Yoruba, the world of Yoruba traditional culture. For my non-Yoruba colleagues, too, I beg your indulgence for speaking so specifically about Yoruba traditional culture. But it is my intention to provide you with some way of thinking through a path toward a specifically Igbo, Hausa, Ibibio, or any other ethno-culturally specific set of notions about the poetics of sound and the world in which sound resounds. Part 1. The Trouble with Music. My research has focused quite closely on the music of the black inhabitants of the rainforests of the Pacific coast of the South American nation of Colombia, where enslaved Africans from various parts of the continent arrived, primarily during the 18th century, and where they were able to develop and maintain their own particular way of being in the world, on the outskirts of the Spanish colony and the Colombian Republic that succeeded it. I want to take a moment to play some sounds and images from the Colombian Pacific for you.
Carmelo, ella Villa Carmela, que me prestara tu saco.
Clearly, this is a phenomenon not easily accounted for by the Western idea of music with all of the ideologies that entails. Its philosophical connotations in Kant and Schopenhauer of transcendent autonomy from the world, The political economy of its production and distribution by musical, technological, and administrative professionals in the culture industry, whether as sheet music or Spotify algorithms. The esoteric terms of its formal logics through tonal analysis, its ideologies of consumption under capitalist delineations between work and leisure, its bounding into notions of the musical work delimited by mute musical scores rather than by actual instances of sounding or hearing, none of those apply to what we just heard and saw. Ethnomusicologists, of course, are aware of the incommensurability of the music concept, not only for the sounded poetics of the Colombian Pacific, but for a wide swath of non-Western sounded artists. Indeed, as early as 1885, the British proto-ethnomusicologist Alexander Ellis developed the sense system for measuring the musical scales of many nations which do not conform to the Western tempered scale. In doing so, Ellis proposed a relativization of Western notions of music, such that the concept of music was opened up beyond a strictly Western conception to admit different but equally logical scales, rhythmic cycles, and other forms of formal organization. Ellis's work and that of his German contemporary, Guido Adler, were taken up by a successive generation of scholars engaged in comparative musicology, a term which in and of itself relied on this relativist notion of a music concept opened out beyond strictly Western forms. This relativism remained central in ethnomusicology when it was established in the 1950s. Indeed, even when I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, the comparativist calls of Bruno Nettel were an important part of the curriculum. But it is one thing to open up the category of music to include non-Western forms of organizing sound, a gesture almost of beneficence, by which non-Western forms are permitted to enjoy the cachet of music alongside Western music. Increasingly, over the course of my career, however, I have become more convinced that the frame of music, even when dutifully relativized, still makes demands on traditional sounded practices in ways that can be profoundly disruptive. For example, the past 20 years or so have seen the staging of the Colombian Pacific sounded poetics as music in the Western sense, on festival stages and music albums, for purposes of political mobilizations, economic development, and a whole gamut of other reasons foreign to, and even inimical to, local conceptions of these sounded poetics. New formal demands, time limits, virtuosic solos, Western tuning, musical professionalization, began to be put on these sounded poetics and their practitioners. Few of these individuals were able to transform themselves into professional paid musicians. More commonly, professional musicians appropriated these sounded poetics in order to convert them into music. Thus, the rural practitioners closest to the full gamut of meanings and functions of these sounded poetics and the cosmology underlying them have been unable to benefit from the new framing of Pacific music that is necessary to reap economic benefit on the open market. Indeed, as rural lifeways are increasingly transformed by the ravages of capitalist inequality, these forms are increasingly disappearing from their home villages, while, under the rubric of music, processed into forms relatable for urban consumers and violently stripped of their cosmological functions, the sounded component of these poetics, but not their precious meanings, thrive in the cities, pressed into new functions and meanings of much utility for black urbanites and for the children of Pacific migrants, but rather less for the people living in the context of the Pacific themselves. Part 2. From Music to Sound. The field of sound studies, writes Jonathan Stern, is, quote, a name for the interdisciplinary ferment in the human sciences that takes sound as its analytical point of departure or arrival. End quote. Sound studies covers a wide variety of interests, including technologies of recorded sound, histories of listening, the sounded environment of particular sites, natural sound ecology, installations of sound art, the gendered and racialized components of the human voice, and more. Although sound studies began to emerge as a coherent field of inquiry in the academy in the early 2000s, its foundations were laid earlier in the work of the Canadian composer R. Murray Schafer. Schafer, beginning around 1969, introduced the notion of the soundscape, or the acoustic environment of a given locale, which he proposed as an object for aesthetic contemplation. The soundscape was first applied to ethnomusicological study in the influential 1982 monograph Sound and Sentiment, Birds, Weeping, Poetics, and Song in Kaluli Expression by Stephen Feld, born in 1949. Feld describes the linkages between the songs of the Kaluli people in Papua New Guinea and the songs of the birds with which they share their forest home. Feld would go on to describe the, quote, Kaluli's sound-saturated mode of being in the world, end quote, under the term acoustomology, a neologism combining acoustics and epistemology. Acoustomology describes ways of knowing through sound in which the sensation of sound is experienced as both a material and a social fact. Writes Feld in a recent formulation, acoustomology questions sound as a way of knowing. It asks what is knowable and how it becomes known through sounding and listening. Acoustomology engages acoustics at the plane of the audible, acoustos, to inquire into sounding as simultaneously social and material. Feld's framing provides an important model for moving beyond the fixedness of the music concept that I described in the previous section. However, while sound studies has managed to largely sidestep music, it nonetheless remains indebted to Northern Atlantic frames of reference. In the introduction to their essential 2019 edited volume, Remapping Sound Studies, the ethnomusicologists Gavin Steingo and Jim Sykes note that, quote, sound studies has largely elided the global south, end quote, noting, quote, a certain homogenization of the listening subject. In much canonical work, he or she is white and middle class, end quote. Steingo and Sykes note that Routledge's 4-volume, 72-chapter, 1,500-page Sound Studies anthology from 2013, quote, does not contain a single chapter on Africa or Asia, which together form more than half of the world's landmass and currently comprise more than 100 sovereign nation-states. One reason for this eye-popping omission is that, and why it was allowed to, one reason that this eye-popping omission was allowed to stand in a supposedly authoritative anthology is that the listening subject ascribed by sound studies is a quintessentially Western figure. In Schafer's work, for example, the listener of soundscapes seems heir to the European Romantics, retreating from the alienations of modernity into the solitary contemplation of unsullied nature, retreating into the sanctity of hermetic individuality and the self-actualization of self-abnegating aestheticization of the natural world. Mainstream sound studies, then, assumes kinds of personhood, such as the solitary and unmoored individual, that do not function in other settings. Even Feld's acoustomology, as applied to the Kaluli setting, does not necessarily apply universally. For one thing, acoustomology, with its root word, epistemology, privileges knowing as what happens through sound. This de-emphasizes other relations, such as feeling, and by emphasizing knowledge, it does not recognize the power of sound to act, to do things in the world. Furthermore, while acoustomology posits a multiplicity of epistemological frameworks that human cultural groups apply to the world, it implies that they are essentially dealing with a single, unitary, ontological framework, which happens to be the Western scientific framework. If Feld's acoustomology describes a world in which the Kaluli believe their ancestors to be birds, but the reader is assumed to know better, I believe we need to find an explanatory mechanism for a world in which, for all intents and purposes, birds are ancestors, as uncanny and unimaginable as that might be for readers. Thus, in my own work, instead of using Feld's acoustomology to emphasize how the Kaluli know the world, I use my own more expansive neologism, sound world, to suggest that the Colombian Pacific, populated by human, natural, and divine actors, is in many ways an ontologically different world. This opens a line of inquiry that Feld does not. In his description of the Kaluli soundscape, people listen to each other and listen to nature, which includes ancestors and spirits. What he does not engage, however, is the ways in which nature and the realm of the divine listen back. This notion of a world in which nature, the dead, and the divinities listen to humans as much as humans listen to them is absolutely indispensable, I would argue, to understand the sound world of Yoruba Isheshe acoustomology. The sound world. Sound as Sound, Part 3. To understand the Isheshe conception of sound, which is after all the task at hand, the moves I have outlined are indispensable. To review, these moves are, firstly, the move from music to sound. Secondly, the understanding of sound not as an isolated feature of the world, but as a thread that pulls on the fabric of the cosmos itself, a cosmos inhabited also by the divine and by the natural, not only by the human, a cosmos that not only sounds, but also listens. As it turns out, these clarifications, although they do not appear in the canon of sound studies, were already being elaborated in the late 60s, roughly simultaneously with the activities of R. Murray Schafer. I am referring to an essay entitled Nigerian Musicians Then and Now, published in Nigeria magazine, an important outlet for the intelligentsia of the newly independent nation by the great Nigerian musician and intellectual Fela Shawande in 1967, when, coincidentally, he was a research fellow at the University of Ibadan. This essay, which was brought to my attention by a brilliant PhD candidate in the musicology and ethnomusicology at Boston University, where I teach, Brian Barone, finds Shawande taking on the project of a Nigerian national music by inquiring into pre-colonial music. Writes Shawande, "What musical material," he asks, "would we have found in Nigeria of around 1800? What is more important than the actual material he finds is the necessity to reframe the notion of music in the first place, precisely by shifting from the use of the term music to the term sound, later pure sound, and sound as sound." Shawande writes, "What did music mean to traditional society in Nigeria? Western authorities," and I should note that he specifically names elsewhere in the essay the seminal ethnomusicologist Alan Merriam, who had in fact recently visited Nigeria. Western authorities subscribe to the notion that music is an aspect of human behavior, and that therefore music must be studied from many standpoints. But were we to attempt to sell this idea to traditional man in Nigeria, he would tell us to get lost. Our Nigerian traditional man would tell us that sound was evocative. Notice the pivot to sound. But that by its very nature, it was evocative. He would point to his words of power, which he has used time and again to produce tangible results. If he happens to be a Yoruba, he would refer to those terrible vocal forms handed to him by his forefathers, such as the Asan, the Ogede, or the Ofo, patterns of pure sound. Nigerian traditional man knew, at least in Yoruba land, that the medium of sound he could evoke and handle, through the medium of sound he could evoke and handle the psychic forces of tremendous potencies, which his will could then direct as it suited his purpose. He knew this, not as theory, but as experienced fact. What is striking here is that while Shoande's question, written on this side of the historical ruptures of the colonial experience, inquires into music, he must shift to sound as the only way the answer could be given from a pre-colonial vantage point. Moreover, this sound does not simply exist in the world, resonating through space to be contemplated by humans, as in Schaeffer's account. Rather, sound is a force in the world, tied to broader currents of energies circulating, and as such, a tool that could be used more than a sensation to be experienced. This is because the world itself, as described by Shoande, is living, dynamic, and itself permeated with ebb and flow and clash of energies, of which sound is only one. Shoande continues. He continues by describing this world, concluding by noting the futility of studying what he calls sound as sound in the limited terms offered by the notion of music. Quote, Nigerian traditional man saw himself dynamically related to a cosmos that was a living dynamic organism, and sound as sound became one of the most effective means of bringing that dynamic relationship into play. We shall never penetrate beneath the surface of Nigerian traditional music until and unless we adopt this view of traditional man, who is likely to reject out of hand our present way of studying traditional music through the measuring of intervals, analysis of rhythms, examining of song texts, meticulous cataloging of styles, etc. If we wish, as Shoande suggests, to move beyond superficial understandings of Nigerian or Yoruba traditional music, we must engage with the Isheshe sound and the Isheshe world on their own terms. For that, we must leave behind the limitations of the Western music construct and, as Shoande allows me to insist, to leave behind even notions of sound, if those notions assume Western understandings of the world as disenchanted, empty, aside from humans, and bereft of the currents of divine and spiritual force of what the Yoruba call Ashe, which are so central to the Isheshe sound world. Part 4. Concretion and Abstraction. Call and Response. The Yoruba art historian Rowland Abiodun decries his discipline as a, quote, point-and-shoot conceptual framework. When he appears out of focus in a photograph next to his fair-skinned wife, he explains, he recognizes that the camera has pre-programmed settings calibrated for people of her complexion, but not of his. He offers then his own settings, his own calibration of the camera, as it were, for an art history capable of capturing Yoruba realities. For example, he introduces Yoruba terms describing the qualities of compelling art and the character of the artist that makes it. Furthermore, and at the risk of flattening out a complex argument, he suggests that the Yoruba universe assumes that every being has an essence in Ori and an essential being in Iwa. The fountainhead of meaning in the world, or Ora, is similarly abstract and complex, and therefore it is through Owe, often defined as proverbs, but which Abiodun glosses as analogies or tropes that they are made concrete. Owe are what is necessary for human understanding of the larger truth of Ora. A similar relation of abstraction and concretion governs the relationship between Ori and Oriki, the citation of the Ori. Indeed, Abiodun and other scholars such as Olabiyai, J.A. Ayorinde, Alasope Oyelaran, and the Briton Karen Barber suggest that all Yoruba art is a version of the Oriki, irregardless if it is carried out through language, sculpture, sound, or some other medium. It is essentially multisensory Oriki. On this chart, we see abstraction on one side and concretion on the other. The question is the nature of the relationship between them, which I've marked with arrows on this chart. The form of concretion of owe is not dissimilar from the English term metaphor, derived from the Greek metapherein, to carry over, given that a popular refrain has it in Yoruba that owe lesin ara, owe is the horse of Ora. But Abiodun and his interlocutors insist that Owe and Oriki do not represent essence in the sense that Western art represents. Instead, as we can see, Oriki energize, prepare, and summon their subject into action. Yoruba art forms are affective. They cause, they influence, and transform. Barber writes that Oriki are neither narrative nor descriptive, but vocative. They are addressed to their subject or owner and are felt to encapsulate and evoke in some way that subject's essential powers and qualities. To ki, perform Oriki, and to be or ya, carve, is to provoke and be provoked, writes Yai. Thus, returning to the chart and asking the question of the relationship between the concrete and the abstract, these forms do not represent that essence. They call it, they address it, they provoke it into response. This is significantly different from representation in that concretion is not mimetic, but vocative, as Barber says. It calls the essence into manifestation. Thus, Yoruba arts do not merely exhibit aesthetic or epistemological differences, differences of appreciation or forms of understanding the world. Rather, they inhabit, in some ways, a different world, a world in which the arts have and harness ashe, the forces or energies circulating through the cosmos. These arts, says Abiodun, operate by identifying the targeted subjects by their original or primordial names and calling them. The Yoruba believe that they must answer or respond, je or daun, that is, they must obey the caller. These properties suggest that the Yoruba world is one in which it is not only humans that do the listening. In Abiodun's rendering, humans with good character and compelling artworks are understood to have iluti, the quality of good hearing. That is, they respond when called. The divinities, too, should hear and worship as well. As the saying goes, Eborato luti langbo. We worship and celebrate only those deities who can respond when called upon. Indeed, there are many entities listening in the Yoruba world. Even certain objects, such as ceremonial objects with ashe, or the curse object called ale, respond to spoken or sung incantations. Part 5. Ifa and the Isheshe ear. Up until now, I have explained the ground that I needed to clear in order to actually arrive at the project that I hope to carry out in Yoruba land once I am able to travel there. I have described the insufficiency of the music concept to introduce the notion of knowing through sound, and I have swept aside the idea of knowing through sound in favor of a system in which the sounded arts act on the world. I have described the possibility that the world being described is ontologically different from the anthropocentric world of Western thought, and introduced the possibility of sounded arts that do not represent but compel and invoke spiritual energy and forces. This is also a world in which it is not only humans, but also animals, plants, divinities, and even objects that are capable of listening and being called into action by sound. It is with this ground cleared that I begin to propose my research in Yorubaland. Although I have received a grant from the West African Research Association, thank you, Wara, to carry out this work, I have yet to actually do it. But I wanted to tell you all about some of the things I plan to look at now that I think I have been able to arrive at an understanding of Yoruba-derived theoretical concepts that I hope to understand. As my case study, I am interested in examining the place of musical and non-musical sound in Ifa, the Yoruba divination system. I am interested in Ifa because although it is central to the Yoruba cosmos and has been discussed extensively in Western anthropology and art history, these accounts do not take into account the incommensurability of Ifa with the categories those disciplines reserve for it, or of the active and dynamic Yoruba world in which Ifa devotion and ritual take place. While the extensive scholarly literature on Ifa often treats it as text, and its carved and beaded implements as material artifacts, they have long ignored that Ifa texts are not dead words, but they are chanted, often with drums and bells, and that the Ifa implements are not mute objects, but double as rattles and tappers. Indeed, sound and hearing appear throughout Ifa verses as metaphors for practices of attentiveness and moral clarity. I propose to focus explicitly on both musical and non-musical sounds in Ifa to reveal their formal organization, material practices, ethical resonances, and philosophical importance in Ifa. The eminent scholar and Ifa priest, Babalao, Wande Abimbola, states quite unequivocally that the chanting of Iyere, of Ifa verses, often accompanied by iron bells, agogo, or Ifa drums called ipese, is, quote, the most important form of performance, end quote, in Ifa tradition. It takes place on momentous occasions such as the funerals of Ifa priests at annual Ifa festivals or in times of great public need such as epidemics. This most important context and its music have been largely overlooked in scholarship on Ifa. Multisensorial metaphors in which sound bridges color, object, and words become powerfully charged experiences of synesthesia, deliberate forms of sensory saturation that, in the words of Ademola Adegbite, quote, enable the devotees of the Orisha to bridge the gap between the visible and invisible worlds, and thus bring them into direct contact with those psychic forces that control the destinies of man. End quote. Sound, then, not only represents but enacts people's entanglement with divinities, oriki, masks, plants, animals, costumes, numbers, calendrical dates, and more in the realm of experience and perception. Meanwhile, ethnomusicological studies of Yoruba music have little to say on Ifa, ignoring the Ifa bells and passing quickly over the Ipese drums, which are usually listed alongside more canonical ensembles such as the Bata, Dundun, and Igbing, but have not been subjected to more sustained analysis, perhaps because of their specialization. On this specialization, Aziz Akinwumi Shesan writes that only, quote, only the initiate can beat Ipese, and the meaning of what Ipese is saying can only be understood by the initiates. It is unclear if he means initiates of Ifa, of the drumming deity Anya, or both. But this specialization also appears in some Ifa verses, in which Ipese Ifa drummers vie with Agba drummers of the Ogboni fraternity. Nor have scholars of music examined the multisensorial and extra-musical significance of Ifa music. They have not examined whether or how chanted ire or Ifa drums and bells engage in the multisensorial illusions that overflow boundaries between musical, plastic, literary, and other media. Yoruba drumming, as is well known, reproduces the tones of Yoruba language to recite oriki and other incantations. Surely the vast body of the Ifa verses, the Ese Ifa, should provide a particularly powerful repertoire for drummed recitation, but that has not yet been discussed. There is also the matter of the mathematical ramifications of the binary or ejiwapo structure of Odu Ifa. Do these patterns also manifest in the temporal subdivisions of Ifa music? Even beyond music specifically, sound is essential to Ifa practice. How otherwise to explain that the carved tray, Opon Ifa, on which the divination signs are recorded, has a concave space carved out of its back in order to allow it to resonate when tapped by the curved wooden diviner's implement, the Iroke Ifa. The indispensable Iroke Ifa, translated as both divination tapper and divination bell, is central to divination practice and sonically quite complex. Every divination and propitiation ritual opens before any words are spoken with the Iroke tapped on the tray. Moreover, the Iroke also contains a small rattle that you can see here that is shaken rhythmically to emphasize speech or to punctuate song or the chanting of Ifa verses. If sound is so indispensable in Ifa, who hears it? Listeners seem to include not only living humans, but also the dead and the divinities invoked in the tapping of the Iroke on the Opon. Whether heard by the living, the dead, or the divinities, attending to sound further begs the question of the nature of hearing. Yoruba proverbs, Owe, that I mentioned before, and Ifa verses would seem to suggest that hearing, bo, metonymized by the ear, eti, is variously the act of becoming aware, the passing of moral judgment, or the always limited and contingent capacity for understanding and misunderstanding. Ifa verses frequently warn supplicants to attend closely, or fetigbo, put ears to listen, and chastise those who have no ears, ko leti, or who are disobedient. I look forward to traveling to Nigeria to engage in my own process of listening in order to unearth the complexities of listening in the Isheshe sound world. Part 6. Listen well, an inconclusive conclusion. I want to end this talk by looking beyond some of the specific findings of the research that I hope to do, in order to anticipate some of the questions which I believe they may raise. Firstly, I want to emphasize that a persistent difficulty in the kind of ontologically inflected research I have suggested here is that it is difficult to find its edges, where it ends. That is, where, when, and how does the expansive understanding of the sound world, with its ontological relativism and its refusal to separate sound from music, when, where, and how does it confront the increasing encroachment of Western paradigms, the same Western paradigms I have suggested we leave behind? What happens, in other words, when the music concept is forced on the Isheshe sound world? This may be indeed the panorama of post-colonial Nigeria, in which the Isheshe sound arts might be understood to have been steamrolled by musical modernity. Yet, the results are not so one-sided as we might believe. A proliferation of unexpected creolizations has emerged. The journey of the Yoruba sound world with the practices of Orisha, devotion, and even Ifa across the Atlantic to Cuba, Brazil, Trinidad, and then secondhand to the United States, to my home city of New York, to Venezuela, to Mexico, and beyond, suggest the resilience of forms such as bata drumming or the agbe ensemble, even despite the loss of the Yoruba language. Whatever the processes of preservation or change of the sounded material, of the music, we might say, the question of changes in or maintenance of the epistemological and ontological framework, the sound world in which these sounds are taking place, remains unexplored. Even within Nigeria itself, and in a far shorter historical sweep, we can see these dynamics in the adoption and reinvention of Akbala music, itself a popular music form, but one based on the quintessentially Yoruba art form of the Oriki, by Afrobeats artists such as Qdot, whose convincing skills as a wordsmith in the Yoruba language, but ensconced in the rap idiom, suggest not a westernizing musicalization of the Yoruba sound arts, but an indigenizing Yorubaization of music, although not one with a particularly strong investment in the principles of the Isheshe cosmology. This is in some ways what Showande prescribed in music education in Nigerian schools, an article published as a companion piece to Nigerian Musicians Then and Now, which I cited before. In the latter, as I suggested, Showande made a distinction between the specific Western notion of music and the broader Isheshe notion of sound as sound. The category of music suggests my student, Brian Barone, in his take on Showande's articles, was something of a disenchanted category. Music was a sounding in a world with little spiritual energy or divine spark. No ashe. While the powerful evocation of pre-colonial sound seemed to lie on the other side of the insurmountable breach of colonialism. But in the other article, Music Education in Nigerian Schools, Showande does not reiterate a separation between Western music and indigenous sound, but recommends their synthesis, quote, to examine how far European structures can be used with advantage for African music. To conclude, I cite Brian writing about Showande. Brian Barone writes, though it was at first carried in the books and voices of missionaries, music's role in colonial Nigeria was, ironically, to desacralize sound, and with it, music, to mischaracterize the experience of evocative sounding as an object of the choir master or the ethnomusicologist's professional competency. But if the task standing before independent Nigeria was to re-enchant music by way of remembering pre-colonial sound, this was not a challenge facing Nigeria alone. Indeed, it was equally a crisis in the West and elsewhere, whether Westerners were paying attention or not. And it was this globalized nature of the problem that underwrote Showande's confidence that Nigeria's re-engagement with sound could light the way for the rest of the world. With that note, on that note, that Nigeria's re-engagement with sound through music education, like what you are doing in the Department of Music and the University of Ibadan, the possibility and the hope that that could light the way for the rest of the world, I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
I want
to say thank you to the student who came up to perform just immediately after the lecture. I want to go on to thank our guest lecturer, Michael B. Quintero, for the beautiful, very deep, incisive lecture that he had delivered. That's the maiden lecture in this personality lecture series. Want to really thank you on behalf of the head of department and the members of staff of the Department of Music and the entire student body of Department of Music and the faculty in the University of Ibadan. We want to say thank you to our guest lecturer, Michael Quintero. Now we are going to just move on to try and bring up some of the, I will try and, recall as a little bit of what I can talk about. He gave some of the ideas, some of the notions, and some of the postulations of Alexander Ellis on musical scales of many nations. And in this second section, from music to sound, he also did justice to that aspect. And the third section, sound as sound. I know many of our online listeners and viewers and the rest of us here have been following the lecture, and I know we must have been writing and bringing up some of the lectures, some of the questions that you want to raise. On the fourth segment, abstraction and conclusion, you spoke on Owe, the proverbs, analogies and tropes, Oriki, citations of the essence, the Ori, and so on. And then on the fifth segment, he went on to talk on Fa and the Isheshe ear. And the sixth segment, he did talk and lectures us on listening attentively, reading attentively, listen well. So, I want to quickly, because of time, go on to ask those of us who are seated here, how many, those of us with questions on the various segments of this lecture, please, I want you to indicate if, as regarding your questions. Those of you with questions, we would like to see your hands, because we know that as the lecture was going on, you are making notes, and then you are raising issues in your mind, and you want to bring it forth so that our guest lecturer can respond to it. And also online, we want to now, we have about 3-4 people who already indicated and brought up their questions. So we are going to project these questions, and then we will give our guest lecturer the opportunity to respond to these questions. Okay. Dr. Titus, okay, is online, so we want to welcome Dr. Titus to make his observations, his comment.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, please? Can you hear me, please? Are you hearing me? Oh, great. Yeah, thank you, Prof, for this brilliant presentation. And I bring greetings from South Africa, Rhodes University, where I'm currently doing my post-doctoral fellowship. And it's great to hear this words and sounds, because that's partly what I'm doing currently, looking at nature, ethnomusicology specifically, as the environment and issues of oil and gas and the non-musical sounds in the Niger Delta and in Nigeria in general, especially issues of soundscaping in the cities. My first question is observation of that. I think we are getting awareness, and I'm so thankful for the University of Ibadan for this brilliant lecture talking about delineating or look at sounds, okay, in a way that is not just extra musical. Because sometimes, when you present something on non-musical sounds, it's like you are terms anthropologists or kind of non-musical. Like I presented somewhere, and they say, oh boy, how do we now bring new idea that is coming up into our curriculum or into our into our study plans, that even sounds that are not musical are also welcome. How do we do that? Because change is difficult, but we have change. Secondly, how do we categorize? That's my question, because I was in Oxford for a postdoc and looking at oil and gas too, and I asked my supervisor. Now we are talking about sounds from generators, sound from moving machines, relating to oil and exploration. Okay, even now, and he said this sound could be represented on keyboard. Now, but how do we now in the African context signify or categorize some of sounds that could make them a kind of thematic ideas to be studied, basically from the indigenous analysis of Isese and Ifa chants that you explained. What are the criteria and categorization of sounds? Thank you for this brilliant presentation, and thank you, HOD Dr. Samuel and the Department of Music. Thank you. Greetings from Rhodes University.
Begin with, I'm
We want to thank Dr. Titus
really appreciative
from
of
Germany.
sitting
I
through
believe
my
he's still...
my.
Okay.
South Africa.
So we are going to take the second question from Israel Oladele. Olade Ayoronide from South Africa. We want to take all the questions together, and then we'll proceed for you to respond to them together. Please kindly note these questions.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Oladele, you are on now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. Depending on your timeline, wherever we are. Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Professor, for the insightful presentation, and very, 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 very relevant to the current discourse, particularly the ideas around the decolonization. That is is very important to that kind of content, and also by extension, the idea of important discourse that I think we need to consider. But I have three questions. My question is tricorder. The first one is pertaining to the ideas of decolonization. Yeah, you explain, you make an argument for decolonization from the perspective of sound study, acoustemology. So which is very, very fascinating, your argument. Okay. However, the question I want to ask, particularly in relation to the asymmetric power relation between the global north and the global south, in terms of theory, ideologies, and the academic and the mainstream market, decolonization. Whose position are we talking about right now? Are we talking about the global north decolonization? If we can use Roger Kissing, the radical authority, is that what we are talking about? Where nation has become a commodity in the economy, place like Lagos. And yeah, we have to that's my thought, decolonization of from the what and why. For instance, conversation that was had that was in Meki Nzewi in Nigeria last and about the point between musicological study approach to music study in Africa and the ethnomusicological approach. To summarize, the debate is about the question of sound. Do we focus on sound? That is from Lazekwe. But they were side of ethnomusicology. So this conversation has always been around with us. Yes, and it's something that I'm glad that you are bringing back again. But from your own perspective now, so how do we re-engage this question? And I don't think there's a solution anyway, but what is your own take in these two layers? Then the last one is the idea of, is also about accostemology. So the accostemology of the city is quite different to that of the rural space. So talking about Ifa cosmology, Yoruba cosmology, the context of your research is quite located within the what we can call the rural, the ethnomusicological subject historically. So, and like you rightly mentioned about Stephen Feld's work in the Papua New Guinea, was that have engaged the same. Ketia did the same in the 80s, also in the northern Ghana. However, there's another layer, which is the city, the urban ecology. If you're talking Thomas Torino's cosmopolitanism in Zimbabwe, if you're talking about the works of Menkes in the Johannesburg studio, the ideas of sound. So how do we balance this? Are you considering the city life, the cosmopolitan presence and personnel in relation to the Ifa, which has always been a belated subject of the city? Yeah, so thank you very much.
Can I answer those two questions, because they're all a two-parter and a three-parter. So I have 5 questions to ask. I have a lot to say about those two really wonderful sets of questions by Dr. Titus and by Oladele. It's much appreciated. I also want to say live, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thanks again to Sam, to the dean, university, and to the artists who opened and closed. I didn't think that there was going to be live music before and after the presentation. So thank you so much to those artists, the students, I'm assuming at the university. To address Titus's set of questions, what music pedagogy looks like in an African context at all. But I do have a couple ideas about how to work towards sort of from within music. We can also find ways in which the concept of music can be understood as eventually breaking down enough. Now, how of environmental sound is to look at categories of music that are about engaging with environmental sound. So obviously, music has a very long history and a very long tradition, but especially once it's very easy to find experimental composers like Murray Schafer, who I mentioned, but also the earliest composers of electroacoustic music, splicing and so on. He has a very well-known piece of musique concrète, of concrete music, which samples, we would call it now, a very common and I many songs that engage with or talk about or even imitate the sound of the train on the guitar and so on. So I think that sort of opens up a space for looking at the question of the relationship between sound and music that represent environmental sound. That's certainly true in the Western case, certainly true in popular music, and it's particularly true in cases like the Kaluli that Feld was writing about, in which are singing to the birds and hear birds sort of singing to them as their ancestors. So I think that the ways to get at that. In terms of categorization of the different types of sound that you mentioned, I'm less concerned with the categorization of the sounds themselves or the classes of sounds. I'm a little more concerned with the question of how do we classify the systems within which sounds take meaning, right? The kind of meta classification, perhaps, right? What is it? What are systems, or as since I'm very intent in real terms in the ontological sphere, what are the cosmologies or the sound worlds in which sounds can be understood as having different types of meanings? Um, this becomes a much broader case than just looking at sound. You're looking at really things in a much broader register. But I think that that's part of the point. I think that's what we increasingly, what I would like to move towards. For Oladele, thank you for the trinity of questions. They're all great questions. As far as decolonization and power goes, I want to be clear. The taking of material resources and all of these sorts of things, this is how shifts in power take place. There are ways in which thought itself can be the sort of ideological component of thought can be pushed back against, and so in this case, what I imagine the decolonization as is as a kind of uh, a way of reconstructing context that allows the possibility for non-Western understandings of sound and for specifically African understandings of sound. Now, that's far from a concrete and material shift power, but it is at least a way, if you sort of follow ideas of hegemony by consent and so on and so forth, and these sorts of ideas of power based in ideology, then those are at least the beginning of the possibility for different types of self-understandings that can be important in what ultimately need to take place in the political and economic spheres. Another sort of, which I just want to mention, is that it would be very ironic if the discourse colonization ended up becoming something which was only participated in by people in the North and became a sort of academic trend that the rest of the world had to be and learn. That shouldn't be the purpose of these sorts of academic models, and I want to recognize that that potential is certainly there. As far as the polemic in Ilam, is that the name of the journal in the 1970s? I would love to know a lot. If you have those sources, please. Interesting. Um, I had what I want that neither a musicological nor an ethnomusicological nor specifically sound study of way of looking at these things is sufficient. I don't want to I don't want to categorize the types of sounds that are available for analysis. I want to look at those in which they are and resounding. Um, I didn't have the during one of the moments where the audience it actually skipped over some of my discussion of what I wanted to do, thinking about the sounds around Ifa is the aspect of Yoruba traditional culture. Um, the sounded aspect built into the very materiality of the object through which the essay fa of the poetry, the verses of Ifa are given, and yet it's not considered. So I think that sound is, as I said at one point, a string to be pulled that perhaps can lead to the rest of the fabric in an interesting and important way. But I would need to know more about that, and I would love to know the polemic in order to answer your question more. Um, you are absolutely right in terms of the question of the acoustomology of the city and the acoustomology of the country, about a kind of potential for the bracketing, the artificial bracketing, and even the romanticization of traditional and rural culture. Now, I hate to blame it on the glitch, but the last section is essentially about why how I imagine dealing with exactly the question that you're asking. Um, and so when I titled the last section "Listen Well Well," I very deliberately wanted to use a pidgin title rather than either English or Yoruba, because this is certainly the reality of contemporary. And so the question that I want to ask, which is a question which is very, very dear to my heart, and that I did ask in the actual paper and in the recording, is not how do we divide between a sort of rural and traditional and a kind of modern context, but rather how do people move between these different sound worlds? What does it mean to pass in and out? Where exactly are the frontiers? Where are the edges by which one system ends and another one begins? Um, in the Colombian context, which is one that actually moving through the world, traveling internationally, taking out mortgages, doing computer programming, with perhaps spells and magic amulets in their pockets, right? In other words, people are moving between different worlds, between different ontological systems, and that, I think, is an interesting question. The I'm doing a project now. I'm beginning work on a project in my hometown of New York City, which is a project that I want to do in sound rather than in writing. And the project involves setting up microphones at different places in Orisha worship ceremonies in an apartment building in New York, because I'm interested in what happens in the ritual, but I'm also interested in what the leakage of sound and of drumming in particular out into the city of New York means for people that are passing by in a setting in which we're seeing gentrification, in a setting in which we see a kind of pluralism in New York City, a particular model of pluralism by I don't see anything, I don't hear anything, is sort of the way that pluralism works in New York City. And I'm very interested in exactly the type of question that you're asking. But again, not about carving out the differences between them, but trying to figure out the movement back and forth, which is what I tried to talk about a little bit at the end with the passage of Orisha drumming into musical systems like the Cuban bata, and the question of Q-Dot, whose Nuakpala, sort of that song, I think is very interesting, that in some of his freestyles he does something like the way that he raps in a way very compelling and very interesting, and that hopefully address wonderful questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Quintero. There are two other people who will be asking their questions. That is one, Dr. Adeolu Abe from Ondo, DME College of Education, Ondo, and Kayode Odejimi from Ibadan here. So I will want Dr. Abe to please go ahead and ask his question quickly. I believe he's still online. Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me, please?
Yeah.
Please, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Michael, for that presentation. My question is simple. I just want to know, since sound and corresponding meaning culturally based to a large extent, and the world is really going global. Now, how do we achieve the globalization of sound to the comprehension of the world view? And I mean to global context. What I'm trying to say here is your discussion centers around the Ifa, Oracle, and some other things. So now, taking that sound that's derived from that knowledge, how do we take it to the entire world, to their understanding, knowing fully well that so many other cultures have their own sense of understanding and comprehension of sound? So could you please let us know what we can do to project this sound knowledge to the acceptance of the global community? Thank you.
Before Professor Quintero responds to that question, we want Kayode Odejimi to come up forward and ask his question so that the two questions can be answered together. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Firstly, I want to appreciate the music department for organizing this wonderful lecture and for the opportunity given to people like us to be a partaker of it. And to also thank our guest lecturer. Thank you so much. God bless you all. Yeah, my question is looking at the drastical advancement in technology in this 21st century. Has we have so many, the advancement in technology has really affected every, aspect of music and every other aspect of, our general life. And what my question is, as the advancement in technology affect the initial study of ethnomusicologists? That's the first question. And my second question is, how does music reflect the wider culture in which it was created. You know, can we by sound identify a particular music of a particular culture? And the last question is, has the technology in any way affect the performance of this, has the technology affect in any way the performance of our cultural music? You know, we the 21st century musicians, playing all these drums, we don't really like, playing all these drums, bringing agidigbo, like the instrument you just displayed, the ashipa and the igbin drum. You know, how am I supposed to, I'm a very young man, and these are drums, these are traditional sacred drums that, you can't just go, you can't just go there and play them. So how am I supposed to, then go there and perform? I would prefer, play my guitar, play my piano. So my question is just, how does music reflect the wider culture? The wider culture in which it was created. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to both of you. To the first question, to the question of the relationship with the world, I think that in some ways, there are many different ways to answer it. One is that the local sort of can't compete with the global. That's one answer that people have given, that the global will eventually stomp out the local. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that that does happen sometimes, but often there are particular ways in which a phenomenon that's very familiar for Latin Americanists is in some ways the model for what has happened in the rest of the world, which is different sorts of creolizations, different forms of sort of mutations by which ingredients come together and new things emerge from that. Um, I'm very interested, and I'm very struck by Fela Shawande's sort of recipe at the end of that piece, at the very end, which is the idea that the Nigeria's by imagining a sound world that is animated by force, by energy, and I would say to in the terms of the sociology of Weber, a kind of enchanted rather than disenchanted sort of world, is not only sort of fighting for its own existence, right? It also holds the potential to transform what can happen in other parts of the globe. And I want to assure you, if that seems improbable, that through the enslavement of Africans who were kidnapped and taken to the New World, one of the parts is something which is increasingly growing as a tradition, and with a number of different practitioners. It's really quite striking. I don't know what it would look like. There's a wonderful film by the Nigerian Yoruba director Balogun called. This is a film that he made in Brazil, in which a Nigerian protagonist goes to Brazil and sort of discovers his own roots rather than the traditional understanding of a black person from the New World going to Africa and discovering their roots. So I put that forward as an example to suggest the possibility that in many ways uh, African and even specifically Yoruba orientations and musical practices and so on are in many ways already globalized. Now, they may be globalized, which are not recognizable to folks back home, to you all in Ibadan or Ife or Lagos. but they have very profound impacts on what's happening here in the Americas still to this day. Um, I also want to address the question of technology, which I think is a very, very powerful question. I mean, the question of digital technology has really transformed what music making is. It's transformed even what we would imagine to be the most sort of stable, which is the culture industry and the music industry. And in fact, the sort of shocks to the system of the music industry, although it's been able to recuperate its space, have really been drastic. Um, yeah, I think that there's really sort of many ways to imagine that. One thing that I think is very powerful is again that movement and proliferation becomes even more than it was in the past a kind of watchword of music, and music is a very interesting phenomenon because on the one hand it's very free flowing, especially with digital technology. It moves very fast. It can go from one end of the earth to another, and yet music feels very close to us. We experience it very viscerally. We experience it emotionally. We experience it on our bodies. And so that combination of a kind of felt closeness and a felt real geographic and for music, I think something very powerful, and in some ways goes back to. Um, I want to, in terms of how culture is reflected in music. I think that culture is reflected in music, and I think that in many ways, music can also, in itself, shape culture. If one of Abiodun, who I talked about in this talk, one of the things that he says is that art is supposed to be durable. It's supposed to persist over time. But he says Yoruba art doesn't persist over time because of the making of, gigantic stone monuments that last for 2,000 years or, whatever, like the Egyptians. But rather, they last over time because they're iterative, because people continue to practice them, right? And so I think that's a very powerful way in which music can also reflect culture. Let me say one last thing about the relationship between technology and the sound worlds, the sounded cosmologies that I was talking about today. I just want to cite two different authors who have different to understanding the relationship between music and these sorts of sound worlds. One of them I've already talked about today, and that's Stephen Feld. And he has this idea that sound acts as a kind of, or excuse me, recorded sound acts as a kind of mediator. He calls a and it's use that vocabulary. On the other hand, there are also writers. There's a writer named Aisha Belisol de Jesus. And Aisha Belisol de Jesus says that some sounds, nonetheless, Lukumi or New World Yoruba cosmologies, in fact, can cause people to go into, trance possession and so on through a screen. There's a lot of sort of beliefs about the way in which now in a technologically mediated world, in which trance possession and the appearance of the orishas and these different forces appear precisely not only through the mediation of the drums to open up the cosmos and allow the passage of these different forces, but in fact screens themselves are one of the portals through which these deities and these figures sort of move back and forth. So it's really a brave new world, and the dust has not yet settled as to what exactly the impact of technology would be. Um, Thank you so much again for the invitation. I hope to see many of you in Ibadan or in Nigeria or Lagos or here in Boston sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to our online audience, and thank you to our physical audience here at the University of Ibadan. We thank you very much. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor of our university, our Dean, on behalf of staff and students of the Department of Music, we want to appreciate our guest lecturer again, Professor Quintero. Can we appreciate him for the wonderful lecture he's given to us? Thank you, students, for coming, and students from other departments, we thank you for coming. We hope that as often as we have the opportunity, we'll keep this conversation going. So when next we invite you, we want to come. I'd like to thank again members of staff for the support and our students. So we would leave you with the Sheshe here, with the Department of Music Dundu Drum Ensemble, Bata Drum Ensemble, as they close this personality lecture series. Thank you and have a wonderful day.